would like to welcome you, ladies and gentlemen, to the third session of this conference, which is convened by Al Jazeera Center for Studies in cooperation with Al Jazeera Mubashir. This is the Russian-Ukraine war, the redelineation of areas of influence. This session is going to concentrate on the military and strategic perspectives, and we're going to talk about the nature of operations taking place in Ukraine, particularly the reasons behind the resoluteness of Ukrainians vis-à-vis what is happening, and also to what extent Ukraine would be able to continue in such kind of resistance. We would like to welcome our guests. We have from Paris our guests. You're being introduced, sir. Good to have you with us in
Yeah,
this segment. So we have
yeah,
also
this,
Mr. Vadimov, you're being introduced. Sir, you're going to be next. Mr. Alexander, you're being introduced now. We can see you gentlemen in vision. Good to have you with us. We would like to start with Mr. Olivier. Please stand by. So we're going to talk about the. So 1 month has elapsed since the invasion. So there are so many assessments. The Russian command says that it has achieved some of its objectives, but the Ukrainians say that the Russians have failed in achieving their objectives. What is your assessment, sir? Go ahead.
hello, good evening. I believe that the truth is between the two positions. Obviously, the Russians didn't get their entire objective because they thought they could conquer at least half Ukraine in a very short moment. So they did not. However, they reached some gains. Was part of the country. They are still threatening the capital, Kiev, and they are still waging on Donbass, and they have gone out of the peninsula of Crimea up to the Dnieper, the river Dnieper on the north, and on the east up to the Donbass, so clothing the Azov Sea and besieging Mariupol. So I believe that the solution is in middle, that the Russians had to reassess their war objectives, what they did, which is the meaning of their statement. This is one thing. On the other hand, we can observe that the Ukrainian forces resisted remarkably well, which is a surprise for a lot of observers, because at the beginning of the war, a lot of people, including myself, by the way, thought that the Russians would have a better operation than they had. So, bravo to Ukrainians, but I think that this is only 1 month of war, and that this war will last long again.
So the objectives that have been set by the Russians have not achieved their objectives. In your view, what are the objectives that they have not achieved?
Well, they thought that, first of all, a large part of Ukrainian people would welcome them with warmth, which did not happen at all. That's the first point. They thought they could go to Kiev easily, which they did not. They thought that a city like Kharkov, for instance, would be won very easily, and Kharkov is still resisting the advance. So that means that a lot of the military tactical objectives are not met. On the other hand, they've met some other objectives, which is that they've pushed their forces forward in a lot of Ukrainian places, Ukrainian territories. They've seized the entire Azov Sea shore, and the maneuver on the Donbass is still ongoing, and they may hope to gain a local success.
So the tactical objectives, some of them have not been achieved. So that is why the Russians have to try to recalibrate. So we'd like to move now to Mr. Vadim. So you're being introduced by the presenter. Good to have you with us here in this segment. The military command of Russia have said that the first phase of its military operation has come to an end, and this phase has lasted 1 month, and that they're going to start with the second phase. So why the Russian forces have not been decisive in their steps? So do you think that they have failed in planning for what they want to achieve? Because this is going to lead to a lot of losses, including humans and in terms of their military arsenal. Go ahead, sir.
I guess that there is a huge misperception of Russian plans in this operation. Some experts suppose that Russia wanted to commit a kind of a blitzkrieg, means fast attack and complete occupation of Ukraine, which
I
is
do
not
not hear
correct.
him.
The goal of Russian operation was to demilitarize Ukraine, means to neutralize its armed forces. And the other objective was to minimize civilian casualties, civilian losses, and to conduct wars within the frameworks of the international humanitarian law, IHL. Modern wars of such scale are not possible without civil casualties and suffering. But Russian army, and that was the plan, try to minimize those suffering and casualties. Ukrainian army
Good.
was the biggest in Europe in respect of number of people, in respect of number of air defense, armored vehicles, artillery units, and so on. So it was the biggest army in Europe. And the task of the first stage was to neutralize this military potential, means to destroy armored vehicles, aircraft, helicopters, and of course stocks of weapons, which was enormous in Ukraine since the former Soviet Union. So that's why we see quite limited movement of Russian army on the territory of Ukraine. Some experts are surprised by that, but that's natural according to the plan, as far as I know it. And we see remote destruction of military potential of Ukrainian army. My estimates is that Ukrainian army lost its from 60 to 70 assets by today. So that's the task for the first stage of the military operation, and according to Russian military, it's successfully fulfilled.
Я занят, денег кушать возьми.
Very quickly, Mr. Vadim, there are Ukrainian forces that are undergoing many military losses. So are the Russians wanting to stay? Do they want to stay for a long period of time in your view?
Ukraine wants to recruit more civilians for protection of their nation. It's understandable, but it's quite weak force which will be defeated very quickly by professionals that Russia now has, based on the experience in different conflicts, including Syria and other countries.
So the objective is to demilitarize Ukraine, and what has happened is a tactical strategy from the part of the Russian forces. Mr. Kara, so you're being introduced by the presenter. the Ukrainian forces are fighting on different fronts. So this might give the opportunity to the Russian forces to join the forces surrounding Kiev in order to enter Kiev. Do you think that you have enough forces in order to confront the Russian forces, particularly that the Russian forces are much larger than the ones in Ukraine? So what is your view about that? The presenter is asking you.
Well, first of all, if targeting civilians, killing children, it was the primary goal of Russia, yes, it's achieving it, and with a large scale. But if it was to seize capital in a couple of days and install the puppet government in Kiev, it's failed. And actually, our defense forces are conducting pretty successful the strategic defensive operation, and there are several, let's say, key points to that. First of all, defending Kiev, and we have relative success in pushing the Russian invaders out of the northern western parts of Kiev. Several small villages and small towns were liberated a couple of days ago. We held the Russian advance in the northeastern part near Chernigiv. So Chernigiv is encircled, but Russians failed to seize it, and the way to Kiev is not open for the Russians. We are keeping the Russians in the south, and there they have the most advanced, they achieved the most in this, let's say, period of war. We stopped them at Kherson. They cannot advance to other Black Sea cities and port cities because they want to cut Ukraine from the Black Sea. It's one of the major goals of this war. And we are keeping them unsuccessful advance in the Donbass, where the war has been raging on since 2014, when the Russians illegally annexed Crimea and invaded Donetsk and Lugansk region of Ukraine. So there are three directions we are holding the ground, but there are some other aspects to this war, and failing to achieve its quick victory and quick change of government in Ukraine, imposing neutrality or no-block status on Ukraine, the Russians are trying to target not just military targets within the all depths of our territory, but mostly industrial and critical infrastructure, like in Lviv, like in western parts of Ukraine. So they are turning to the let's say, developed technique of destruction of the city, and they developed it in Chechnya, into wars, and then in Syria. So they are trying to terrorize our population that our government need to cope with, and to listen to the Ukrainians struggling to survive, and especially in the most populated by the ethnic Russians and Russian speakers, like in Mariupol, like in Volnovakha, like in Kharkiv. So this war turns to be more brutal from the Russian side, and they are employing more indirect and more indiscriminate targeting of the civilian infrastructure. So I believe it's not a sign that the Russians have achieved their primary goal that they put forward in the first place.
Mr. Alexander, with regard to Donbass, why don't we witness tactical withdrawals from the Ukraine forces and try to surround the Russian forces, in your view?
Well, I'm native of Donetsk, and certainly I would love to see it freed from the Russians. And for 8 years, we, let's say, digged into that land, and we stopped advances of the invader forces for some time. So it would be a strategic mistake for us to get those forces well established and capable of fighting Russians to withdraw, because otherwise we would endanger Kharkiv city, Sumy city, and then we would create a possibility for Russians to advance towards Kiev and to cut Ukraine from the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov. So that's why it was wise for our military commanders to keep the ground in Donbass and to focus more on defending Kiev and those directions that threatening Kiev. Because in other directions there is enough forces, there is enough weaponry to hold the Russians.
So the advancement of the forces. Mr. Olivier, some assessments say that so perhaps Putin would be pushed to put cities down, to demolish whole cities as he has done in Chechnya and as he has done in Syria. Do you think that he is going to win this war if he applies the scorch earth strategy in your view? Go ahead, sir.
Well, what we've seen so far is a Russian tactic which is force on force. They have avoided cities, main of the cities. Some of them have been conquered, but the city that did not enter easily, they surrounded it and they didn't try to push toward them. The maneuver, what we observe is a maneuver which is a force on force. So in Kiev, they are pressing Kiev from the northwest and on the east just to maintain a kind of pressure. The same in Kherson, which is a city bridge over the Dnieper, the river Dnieper in the south of Ukraine that they hold. Where there is a city, a urban warfare, a real, actual urban warfare is in Mariupol, in the south of Donbass, a port on Azov Sea, where the Ukrainian forces entrenched themselves with a lot of forces. And if you think through the probable Russian maneuver, which is to clinch the Ukrainian layout in the Donbass, they cannot afford to have such a stronghold behind them, which explain why actually the only city which is really knowing urban warfare currently is Mariupol, where the Ukrainian forces are, as we know, encircled and probably cut down in two parts. So we can't believe that in the coming days Mariupol will fall to Russian hands, and then that the Russian will reorientate their forces towards Donbass. But once again, if you look at the casualties and the killed people, the official figures from the Ukrainian government say that there are roughly 6,000 people killed, civilian. I'm talking of the civilian, which for a month of war is too much, of course, but it's not that many compared to other wars and conflict that we have observed in the past 20 years. So I really believe that's my strategic assessment, and I may understand that people do not concur with me, but my observation, my strategic observation is a force on force maneuver instead than a force on civilian maneuver.
So, Mr. Ovier, you don't think that the scorched earth is going to succeed? So, is the situation is going to stay as it is? Is it going to continue? Do you think that there is going to be a fear that civilians are going to be targeted? Perhaps is this going to impede the scorched earth strategy from the Russian part?
What I see is what are they doing now? They are entrenching around Kiev. They try to take the Chernihiv northeast of Kiev so that they have a logistic supply route which is free of movement, and they are relocating their forces to put an effort on Donbass. This is what I see, which doesn't mean that in the future they may not go for urban warfare here and there or a general urban warfare. However, if you look at their forces, to make a urban warfare, you need infantrymen. and the Russians do not have that many infantrymen. So that's why I believe they will besiege, they will encircle, but they will not try to enter the cities very quickly. So it will take time. They will take time. That said, once if they succeed, and there is a big if, obviously, if they succeed in repulsing the Ukrainian layout in the Ukrainian forces west of Donbass, they may change. So this is something we're going to see, and I'm very bad on predicting future. I'm better at predicting the past.
So
J'entends rien.
resorting to a scorched earth is something that would depend on what is going to happen. Mr. Vladim, so the Russian forces are using unencrypted networks, and they lack provisions. The soldiers lack provisions, and also they lack fuel. So during the coming phase, so we're going to see the melting of snow, and this is perhaps going to aggravate the situation. How do you see that, sir?
First of all, I want to underline that we see fighting not only on the ground, but we see fighting in the information sphere. And this information warfare is conducted not between Ukraine and Russia, but between Russia and the West. All Western media nowadays are engaged in the war against Russia, and we have seen plenty of fake news which are initiated not only by media but by special troops within the Ukrainian security agency. They have special unit with something like 200 people who professionally have to produce fake news. That's normal and that's natural for wartime. So plenty of information which is available in the web, it's a fake news, mainly applying to feelings of people and mainly underlying human suffering, and presenting the general picture in such a way that the goal of Russian army is to target civilians and to destroy civil infrastructure, which is absolutely incorrect. The main target of Russia is the Ukrainian armed forces, and that's obvious and that's reasonable, as I mentioned before. As for communication, I can tell you that Russian units, starting from the level of campaign, have space communication, each of them, and they do not need civilian networks. Meantime, I want to draw your attention to the fact that civilian networks, the telephone communication and others, they all operative in Ukraine. They are not distracted. Isn't it a surprise for the wartime that Russians allow civil people to use their cell phones to communicate their relatives and their friends, to get information about their life and their conditions? I also want to underline that the International Committee of the Red Cross is present on the territory occupied by Russian forces. Russia supplies foodstuffs, water, means for communication, shelter like tents, and fuel for civil population which escapes from the war zone. So I want to underline that Russia does not target civil population. Sometimes it happens inevitably to destroy civil objects. That's true. But it means that those objects were used by Ukrainian forces for attacking Russian troops, and Russians had to regain those objects. Of course, there are plenty of cases like that, and it doesn't mean that the IHL is properly observed, but it's a wartime, and it happens in any conflict like that. I just want to repeat again that the most important goal for Russia is to destroy military potential of Ukrainian armed forces, and they achieved this goal to the level of 60–70%. Nowadays, Ukrainian forces do not have air defense. They do not have almost air force. They have to use guerrilla methods and guerrilla weapons to fight with Russian army. And actually, that was the plan of Russia. So the stage 1 is over, and nowadays anti-guerrilla operation, that's the plan for the stage 2.
Hello. Sorry, I had no more battery, so I'm on my smartphone. I had no more battery on my computer, so I'm on my smartphone now. Sorry.
So they're going to be moving to the entrenchment now, the Russians. So do you think
That's
that
good.
the Ukrainian forces, they have attack weapons as good as the defense weapons they have? Go ahead, sir, Mr. Kara.
Yeah. Well, first of all, the Russians pumped billions of dollars into propaganda channels, and they failed just to convey the world they are liberators in Ukraine, and they are not targeting civilians. Everyone can Google Kharkiv, Mariupol, or Volnovakha. You can see how these cities, the whole cities, were just wiped out of the earth, and that's why there is a lie that the Russians are not targeting the civilians. I'm not talking even about Kiev, the capital of the city. So if you're talking about entrenchments of Russians, yes, they're trying to do this on the north outskirts of Kiev, but they fail to do this in the eastern part and the western part of the city. And even if they accumulate all those forces employed in Ukraine right now against Kiev, they would fail to seize the capital because they don't have enough forces, don't have enough capabilities. Secondly, if Ukraine was defeated militarily, as the speaker from Russia is saying, and we have some 30% of our military, it means that our military collapsed. So that's why the Russians cannot advance into the city of Kiev and other cities and capture the whole of Ukraine if they defeated Ukrainians. Thirdly, this war is not just about fighting against Ukrainian government or Ukrainian armed forces. This is war about fighting the whole Ukrainian society. Even though pro-Russian forces in Kharkiv, Mariupol, and other southern and eastern cities are fighting against Russians, that's why there is no chance for Russia to conquer Ukraine, because a lot of people are subscribing for the army, for territorial defense, and they are fighting on their own against the Russians. That's why it's not going to happen that the Russians would put their tricolor on Ukrainian capital. If you're talking about arms, yes, they caused pretty big damage to our armed forces, and especially air defense and air force. But with steel operation, those forces are in operation, and the Russian Air Force is freely using the airspace just over those closer to the Russian territories. They are not operating in the skies above Kiev, because our air defense is still operational and effective. We certainly are missing some missiles, the ballistic missiles and cruise missiles hitting from several directions, first and foremost from illegally occupied Crimea, but from the Belarusian territory as well. So that's why we are asking the West to provide us with the air defense and air force capabilities that we can guard our cities and civilians from being targeted directly and purposely by the Russians. That's why we are talking to our Western partners to provide us with the extended range weapons so that we can target those platforms beyond our reach on the territory of occupied Crimea and on Russian territory, and certainly on Belarusian. And I hope that we will get these capabilities, and it will turn Russians to the table, negotiation table, because they would realize that there is no solution of Ukrainian issue, as they refer to, by military means.
Mr. Alexander, when Ukraine gets the capabilities it requests from the West, do you think that we're going to move from the state of defense to the state of attack at some point in time?
At the moment, our armed forces or forces of defense are conducting strategic maneuver defensive operation. They are just securing the key things that we need. They are not trying to risk with the counteroffensive operations, large-scale counteroffensive operations. So that's why they are just trying to use attrition with regard to the Russian forces. They are targeting not just upfront the most capable, fighting capable Russian forces, but first and foremost, our special operation forces are targeting lines of communication. Given that they are poorly, let's say, supplied, the Russian forces, it's pretty successful. So that's why I don't believe that our military commanders are forging plans to turn into the strategic, let's say, counteroffensive operations at the moment, because we understand that Russia is a bigger power. They have a lot of fodder meat. They are throwing all capable and not capable forces, including recruits, including the freedom fighters or those dogs of the war from the Middle East. They are trying to get some people from the other occupied territories like Transnistria, like the garrisons on the occupied territories of Georgia. So they're using scare resources and to change the situation on the ground. So that's why I don't believe that we need to turn into the counteroffensive at the moment. It's better to maneuver. It's better to let's say diminish their ability to advance into our territory and to capture the key cities and key grounds to cut Ukraine into two pieces and to encircle Kiev.
So you think that millions are spent in the propaganda that is being carried out by the Russians against the Ukrainians. So this is not in keeping with what the Russians are saying. They do not think that the Ukrainians are going to carry out a counter operation, which is to move from defense to attack. So she's trying to summarize what you have said. So we're going to move now to Monsieur Olivier. So the Russian command threatens of using chemical weapons or nuclear weapons. Do you think that this is possible? And do you think that this is going to be used or perhaps even target countries of NATO? And what kind of reaction do you think is going to happen if that was the case?
Well, no, I believe that first we have to make a difference between chemical weapons and nuclear weapons. I know that everybody is using the expression of weapons of mass destruction, but these are two very different things. Nuclear is something so threatening that when the major nuclear power in the world, which is Russia, is waging a war against a nation which is not nuclear, nobody will challenge that nuclear power, especially in the alliance, in the Atlantic Alliance that you referred to. Why? Because the Atlantic Alliance is another nuclear alliance with three nuclear powers, which are the United States, UK, and France. And the three nations say, okay, we are not joining the war with Ukraine. And the former interlocutor said, our Western partners. He said partners, not allies. And that's meaningful, because that means that Ukraine is not part of the alliance, and then Ukraine does not get the assurance of a nuclear umbrella. And that makes a difference. And that makes the difference for Ukrainian, that makes the difference for NATO countries, but that makes a difference for Russia as well. Because when Russia is saying, okay, there is a sailing that separates a conventional war to a nuclear war, and we all agree not to cross it, everybody agrees on that. And that's why I do not believe that the Russians first will start with a nuclear weapon, because nuclear weapon is defensive weapon, not offensive weapon, first. And second, this is why they will not aggress NATO. On the chemical
so we're going
thing,
to move to the second guest. Sorry to interrupt you, sir. Sorry to interrupt you. So perhaps we're going to get back to you, Monsieur Olivier. Please stay with us. Mr. Vadim, we're coming to you, sir. So we've been introduced again by the presenter. So the Russian forces are asking a number of other forces from different countries to volunteer. So why does it want to do that? Do they lack forces, or do they want to limit the number of losses within their own armed forces? And what are the military and political repercussions when Muslim fighters try to take part in this war?
Thank you for the interesting question. If you permit, you mentioned nuclear and chemical weapons. I want to indicate again that this issue was raised by Western propaganda, and it sounds a bit funny. As far as about a decade ago, Russia destroyed all its chemical weapons under international agreement and under international supervision. So Russia does not have storages of chemical weapons and does not have facilities for production of chemical weapons. The only country which possesses chemical weapons officially nowadays is the United States. They undertook to destroy their chemical weapons, but by now they still did not do it. They have not done it yet. As for nuclear forces, according to Russian doctrine, it can be used only in case of Russia's state endangered, and there is a risk of disappearing of Russian state. So it means that Russia cannot and have no reason to use any nuclear weapons today. As for foreign volunteers, which you mentioned, please pay attention that the number of Russian troops in Ukraine is rather limited. It's less than 2,000 people. It's much less than Ukrainian army nowadays, by the way. Russia might be even twice larger. Ukrainian army might be twice larger nowadays, given the fact that they gain more conscripts and more volunteers. So the second stage of Russian military operation means wide use of professionals and wide use of professionals in combating guerrilla troops. It's a special profession, and not many military are properly trained to perform this. Meantime, foreign troops have a lot of experience in that, and for example, Syrian troops have plenty of experience for long fight conducted in Syria in the war organized by Western countries, by the way. So Russia does not want to destroy civilian population, to make harm to cities, and you see the city of Kiev stands strong because it's not ruined, though Russia has capacity to destroy cities like that, but Kiev is stable. Russia does not offend it, and the Ukrainian president is in the capital of Kiev. His location is known, and it's not a problem for Russian armed forces to find him and to destroy him with precision weapons. So Russia is not interested to get rid of Ukrainian president, and Russia wants to finally sign an official agreement with Ukrainian powers, which will undertake neutral status of the country, non-alignment to military alliances. That's all what Russia needs. As for religious factor, which you mentioned in your question, I want to underline that it's not a religious war. Religion does not have any relation to the conflict. It's, I would say, civilization or blocking conflict between Russia and NATO, which increased twice since 1999, when Russia received obligation from NATO that NATO will not spread to the territories of the former Warsaw Bloc. So that's the reason for the conflict. It's a conflict based on security problems, not on religious disputes or whatsoever.
So we would like to move now to Mr. Alexander Kara. So Mr. Kara. So the Ukraine command is asking the Europeans to give them aircrafts, but the Western allies, they do not want to enter into any conflict with Russia. So why does the West, insist on only giving them? So why haven't they targeted the Russian territories, in your view?
First of all, I should mention the religious factor, and the Muslims are fighting on our side. We have Crimean Tatars who are Muslims, and they compactly lived in Crimea, now temporarily occupied by Russia. We have Chechens who are fighting against Russians, and we have Azerbaijani who are fighting against Russia on our territory and in our armed forces. So I'm talking not about the religious factor of this war, because it's neo-imperial war. Russia wants to restore its greatness on the expense of Ukraine, but religious factors is there, and certainly we are welcoming our friends from the neighboring countries and those from Muslim countries as well. If we are talking about means, and certainly there is a nuclear factor, and Russia has been threatening the West with nuclear arms beginning in 2014, because when Russia was illegally annexing Crimea, Putin was putting his strategic forces on high alert. This spring, he conducted the tests or the drills of these strategic forces before the invasion. And then he was talking about putting them on the special operation mode, saying that this operation mode would keep the Westerners from supporting Ukraine and stepping into this conflict. So there is a nuclear factor, and it's a major thing that is stopping some European countries from stepping up their support of Ukraine and providing us with the so badly need air defense and air force capabilities. But I think that this conflict, I mean the second part of the conflict, because we are in the 8th year of war with Russia. The war began in February and March 2014, not just 21st of February 2022. So we've seen that the West changed its policies. They begin to arm us, to provide us with defense capabilities that we can defend ourselves according to the UN Charter, according to the Article 51 on the self-defense. They are providing us with a huge amount of military support, and they are changing the character of this support. And I believe that there is a possibility for them to understand the only way to stop Russians from acquiring new lands and new, let's say, the new wins in Ukraine, and not just in Ukraine, because Russia perceives that it's war against the West in general, not against Ukraine. And the Russian speaker is saying that there is a propaganda war between West and Russia, not between Ukraine and Russia. And in their minds, they are fighting against the West, not Ukrainians, even though there isn't a single soldier of a NATO country fighting on our side against the Russians here. But anyway, the Westerners are changing their attitudes. We've seen a huge amount of sanctions unleashed on Russia, like the stopping Nord Stream 2 project. Before the war, Germany was not thinking about it. We've seen providing us with a huge amount of anti-armor and anti-aircraft stuff. And I believe that they will change their mood. They understand that to protect civilians, to deny Russia of winning this war in Ukraine, because Russia would not stop in Ukraine. They would love to extend this war to other countries, because it's just in the whole idea of fighting against the West, the whole idea of withdrawing the sphere of influence in the European continent. So that's why I believe the West would change its mind.
So now we will go to the social media segment. Stay with us, please.
I can't read Arabic and I listen to nothing. J'entends rien là et je ne sais pas lire l'arabe.
So that's it, gentlemen. She's going to thank the three of you and she will end it. Stay with
Thank
us
you for
for
having
2
me.
seconds, please. Oh, there you go. You're showing. I will let you know when she cuts off. She's reintroducing each of you. Please stay with us. I'll let you know when you can turn off. That's it. You're free to go. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
All the
Bye-bye.
best.
I'll switch
Bye-bye.
off.